Putin is in a real panic. Emergency meeting in the Kremlin. The dictator called a secret meeting. The reason is Ukraine's crushing strikes on Russian territory. The result of fear is obvious. The Telegraph reports that Russia is urgently redeploying scarce anti-aircraft systems, Pantsir, straight from the front line to protect Moscow. One of them has already been installed near the refinery in Kapotnya. The vaunted air defense is failing so badly that the unit was even hidden in a protective cage. Moreover, against the backdrop of this total failure, the entire Russian leadership has abruptly changed its tone and begun literally begging for the resumption of negotiations. Splendid results of drone and missile attacks on Russia. Have they finally been pushed to the limit? Putin and the rest of the Russian leadership are begging for negotiations. Ukrainian long-range strikes have brought the Kremlin to its knees. A whole series of panic-stricken statements. Lavrov, Ushakov, and Bortnikov are asking for peace talks. There is no choice left. Bortnikov admits that they will have to negotiate with President Zelenskyy. And even Putin's ideologues have openly admitted Russia no longer has a plan for victory, and instead there is only hysteria. Welcome to the Ukraine Today channel. All the details of the total fear in Moscow and the shameful surrender of the aggressor right now. My name is Andrei Silikov, and this is the latest news from the Kremlin's corridors. Ukrainian long-range sanctions are working perfectly, and the Kremlin has had to admit it. As a result of such powerful Ukrainian attacks, Vladimir Putin has fallen into a real panic and issued a series of emergency statements, realizing that Russian air defenses have been breached and key facilities are burning one after another. The dictator has publicly backed down and announced that Moscow is ready for peace talks with Ukraine. And yet at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, he said the opposite. Why has the tone changed so abruptly?
Russia, nevertheless, as has been said more than once, is ready for peace negotiations with Ukraine. Ready on the basis of the agreements that were reached back in Istanbul.
But of course, it is hard for the bunker man to admit that Kiev has forced him back to the negotiating table. So he basically spat venom, saying that Ukraine is the reason for the halt of the negotiation process in Istanbul.
On the basis of the agreements reached in Istanbul, on the basis of the modalities discussed in Anchorage, and the realities, most importantly, the realities on the ground. As well as the principles set out by me a couple of years ago during a speech at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
And of course, we can't do without the spirit of Anchorage. Everything according to the playbook. But the frightened tone and the awkwardness in the dictator's speech reveal the true state of affairs. The Kremlin is in desperate need of a pause. And the funniest part of the dictator's speech is his blatant complaints about the actions of the armed forces of Ukraine. Putin directly stated that Kyiv, with its precision strikes on Russian territory, is trying to create favorable conditions for itself in the event that negotiations resume. Naturally, and who was hiding that? In other words, the master of the Kremlin admitted that Ukrainian drones have indeed backed him into a corner. Trying to save face before the Z-Patriots, he nervously mumbled about solvable tasks and called the Kyiv authorities neo-Nazis. But the fact remains a fact. Burning Russian oil refineries and airfields have forced Moscow to be the first to talk about peace. He is quoted by the Z-Public Zhivov.
From other statements by the president. Additional threats that the Kyiv regime is trying to create for the Russian Federation must be minimized. This is an absolutely solvable task.
So solvable that every day Russians encounter both kind drones and no less kind missiles, even without any warning. Is this that minimum already, or not yet?
Russia will continue to move confidently in all directions of development, ensuring the safety of citizens and resolving economic issues. Kyiv's terrorist attacks are unable to affect the situation at the front, where Russian troops are liberating territory after territory. The Kyiv regime can only be characterized as neo-Nazi. Nothing like this has happened since the time of the Second World War.
Well, basically, a standard speech. Nothing scares Mother Russia. Kyiv isn't changing the situation globally, but at the same time, there's no gas, no peace for Russians, no economy, and no protection for Crimea either. Instead, there is dissatisfaction with Putin, the stability of Ukrainian strikes, and panic in the common, elite, and military circles of the Russian Federation. And the successful process of isolating the peninsula, which undermines the Federation's positions in both the war and the negotiations. Following Putin, the main mouthpiece of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Sergey Lavrov, also began to whine.
We are fully prepared and ready to resume them at any time, whenever needed, from exactly the point where they left off.
Then the minister spiraled into an outright tantrum. Lavrov resentfully complained that the Americans had deceived them and the summit in Alaska was designed to buy time to arm Kiev. In reality, it turned out the way it did, Lavrov concluded, effectively admitting at least a diplomatic defeat for Russia before the collective West.
Just yesterday, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations demanded an immediate ceasefire and nothing more. He did not speak of any kind of long-term settlement.
But the real break in the pattern of Russian propaganda was caused by the director of the FSB, Alexander Bortnikov. Commenting on a possible dialogue, he stated,
Zelenskyy is a terrorist. But in Ukraine, there is no one left to talk to. There are no others there with whom one could speak for now, at this stage. He makes the appropriate decisions. We take this into account.
Online, people immediately recalled Putin's famous quote from 2004, and they admit that times have changed dramatically.
Russia does not negotiate with terrorists. It destroys them. Vladimir Putin, 2004. Times have changed.
What exactly is the Kremlin so frantically trying to achieve by mentioning Istanbul and Anchorage? According to experts, everything is perfectly clear. Russia is critically exhausted and dreams of at least freezing the front line. But Putin's wish list remains the same. However, both inside the RF and outside the aggressor country, people see the collapse of Putin's regime, whose economy is bursting at the seams. And the capital and other regions tremble from the regular arrivals of kamikaze drones. It doesn't exactly look like a position of strength. Also, Putin for the first time publicly commented on the devastating UAF strikes on Crimea. At an online meeting, the dictator frantically demanded his generals reduce the consequences of Ukrainian attacks to zero, while collaborators claim that everything is under control. Experts call this demand an admission of total helplessness. Supply routes have turned into highways of death, and the peninsula is falling into deep isolation. Watch for details and insights right now.
Ukraine's massive strikes on Russian military facilities, oil infrastructure, and logistics hubs create a whole range of new problems for the Kremlin. As the German publication Bild writes, in recent weeks, the Ukrainian strategy of long-range strikes has become one of the key factors of pressure on Russia, significantly complicating Vladimir Putin's position both at the front and inside the country.
The damage to the economy is huge, both in terms of oil exports and in terms of supplies within the country and at the front. A dramatic situation has developed on the illegally occupied Crimean Peninsula, where gasoline is no longer sold to private individuals. Jan Klaas Behrens, political scientist and professor at the European University Viadrina, in Frankfurt an der Oder, in a comment to Bild.
Putin instructed the government and the Ministry of Defense to take measures to reduce the consequences of UAF attacks on infrastructure to zero. The Russian dictator assesses the collapse on the peninsula only from the perspective of the disruption of the tourist season. At the same time, according to the UAF naval forces, the Russian command considers the threat of a Ukrainian landing in Crimea to be real. And throughout June, it has been actively strengthening fortifications on the peninsula.
Now, the servicemen of the Russian Federation are increasingly trying to focus on the so-called defense of Western Crimea, because right there, on the western coast of Crimea, they expect or think that a Ukrainian landing might come from exactly that direction. And as for the situation in Crimea itself, we see that the Kerch Bridge is already paralyzed now, meaning the passage to the Kerch Bridge is completely closed. As for the ferry crossing, after the attack on the Panagia, the ferry crossings are also blocked. The ferries are not operating right now. They are trying to use landing ships for transportation, for passenger transport.
The loss of Crimea will deal Vladimir Putin a crushing double blow. Strategically, due to the loss of a key naval outpost in the Black Sea and the isolation of the army's southern flank, and also symbolically, due to the collapse of the main ideological propaganda myth about the so-called sacred status of the peninsula.
Today, the stage of the siege of Crimea is being carried out. If we draw parallels with such historical military history, Russia has always struggled to hold on to Crimea. And we know plenty of examples where essentially without truly reliable logistics in place, holding Crimea was in reality practically impossible. And today, we clearly understand that one of the key aspects that actually and significantly affects the situation in Crimea continues to be the issue of fuel supplies and essentially the ongoing creation of an electricity shortage. This shortage in particular continues to have a notable impact on the region.
The Ukrainian army continues to pull the rug out from under Putin's feet. The Special Operations Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and drone system units conducted a coordinated night attack, successfully hitting more than 60 targets in occupied Crimea and on mainland directions. The railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal has been completely destroyed. It became the first Russian bridge in Crimea destroyed by strike drones since the start of Ukraine's campaign against military logistical infrastructure on the occupied peninsula. Also, 3 military aircraft and 4 air defense systems were put out of action. In addition, precision strikes destroyed key energy hubs, an oil depot in Kerch, and supply columns and fuel tankers in the Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia regions were eliminated.
This was a strategic military logistical artery for the Russian occupiers. The facility was part of a transport corridor for moving cargo, resources, and military supplies in 2 key directions, from Russian territory through Crimea to supply the troop grouping in the southern direction, as well as within the peninsula to maintain the functioning of the Crimean military infrastructure. Special Operations Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on Telegram.
Drone strikes, gasoline shortages, and blackouts have brought the fighting into the daily lives of Russians. Experts believe that it is the combination of military, economic, and psychological pressure from within that undermines long-term plans of Moscow and is gradually becoming one of the main threats to the Kremlin regime's strategy in the war against Ukraine. Victoria Chistukhina for Freedom TV channel.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin's repressive machine has reached a point of total absurdity. Now, in Russia, it is officially forbidden to criticize terrorists. A court in Rostov-on-Don has, for the first time in history, fined a local resident for a comment criticizing the movement, the Taliban, allegedly for inciting hatred between the peoples of the Russian Federation and Afghanistan. In its paranoia, the Putin regime is constantly expanding its lists of enemies of the state, churning out new registries of foreign agents, unfriendly countries, and extremists. How is the Kremlin concentration camp finally losing its mind and destroying any manifestation of common sense within the country? Watch in our report.
After the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian army, the Kremlin has extremely expanded discriminatory and repressive practices. In 2022, anti-war protests led to a record number of arrests. The subsequent laws on discrediting the army and so-called fakes legally established a total ban on any criticism of the war and Putin's policies. There is no one left to resist these new measures. There is simply no opposition left in the country.
The authorities are also reviving old symbols of political repression. Recently, the FSB Academy of Russia, where Putin trained as a KGB agent, was renamed in honor of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the infamous founder of the Soviet secret police. And Putin himself publicly supported the restrictions, stating they were necessary for security purposes. In other words, life during wartime implies the need to put up with certain inconveniences. And the intensification of repression by Russian intelligence services against civilian life shows almost no signs of weakening. From a CNN publication.
In 2025, Russian courts handed down at least 458 sentences under articles on high treason, espionage, confidential cooperation with a foreign state, and aiding the enemy. And in the first quarter of 2026, the number of criminal cases of high treason filed in Russian courts exceeded the figures for 2025 by a quarter.
Every month, courts handed down between 25 and 44 sentences. Peak values were recorded in November, with 44 sentences, as well as in February, April, and August, with 42 sentences each. The lowest intensity was observed in January with 25 sentences and May with 31, which is solely due to the large number of non-working days, because of the New Year and May holidays. This statistic proves the systemic, conveyor-like nature of the persecutions. From a publication on the website of the Human Rights Project First Department.
The Russian regime is putting pressure on major internet players, video hosting services, messengers, and specialized corporations. In the Federation, almost all popular foreign networks have been blocked, and the Meta Corporation has even been recognized as an extremist organization. Since 2024, Russia has been slowing down YouTube, and in 2025, Roskomnadzor began blocking FaceTime as well as the Telegram and WhatsApp messengers. Furthermore, the authorities have declared war on applications that allow users to bypass these blocks. They have created so-called white lists of loyal online resources, and they forced government employees to install the Max app on their smartphones. The major hosting provider Cloudflare has flagged this messenger's domain as being spyware.
Just last year, they were testing out Chinese equipment, for that so-called isolated Chinese internet. It was tested and they finished those tests last year. And basically, technically, Russia is now ready to connect such a system, which means, roughly speaking, banning the internet and introducing this so-called internal use internet.
The Russian Volunteer Corps has become a particular threat to the Kremlin. The very fact of its creation destroyed the Kremlin myth of supposedly unanimous Russian support for the war against Ukraine. Moreover, unlike solo pickets or protest actions, the RVC provides an example of a potent and very effective method of direct resistance to the dictatorship. So it is no surprise that Moscow sought to eliminate the founder of the RVC. The main intelligence directorate of Ukraine's defense ministry staged the death of Denis Kapustin, and the $500,000 received from the clients was used to strengthen Ukrainian intelligence.
Our side received the corresponding sum of money allocated by the Russian special services for the execution of this crime. As of right now, the RVC commander is on Ukrainian territory, and he is preparing to carry out the assigned tasks.
In Russia, control works not only through bans, arrests, and fear. The system has begun to act more subtly, experts say. People are given the feeling that there is still some space left for criticism, though in reality it is just a way of identifying those who are disloyal. But what Moscow certainly did not account for was the psychological effect of Ukrainian strikes on military and strategic targets deep in the Russian rear. Such attacks shatter the illusion of safety, which leads to growing discontent among the population.
When everything is burning and blazing every day, it has a very powerful psychological effect. 78 to 80% of Russians would already like to end the war. Yes, they still support the Putin regime, but millions are dying now, up to 1.5 million already, and that is a figure every family feels. This is what makes them think about whether the war is even necessary. This is, of course, a threat to Putin, a threat of riots.
Many analysts agree that the main motive behind Putin's actions remains the fear of losing power. It is becoming harder for the dictator to maintain control over the elites, suppress internal dissent, and maintain the regime's stability. He has no other prospects to offer Russians except for increasingly harsh repression. Natalia Gusak for Freedom TV channel.
Meanwhile, Latvia is urgently preparing for possible airstrikes from the Russian Federation. Local intelligence warns that the bunker dictator lives in a distorted reality, so his steps are absolutely unpredictable. In response, the Baltic states are significantly tightening their defense measures. For example, Lithuania has already allocated €3 million to create an innovative drone interceptor. What other hybrid threats is the European Union preparing for? And how do Europeans intend to firmly restrain the aggressor? Watch it right now in our report.
The Kremlin is preparing new provocations against the Baltic states and Poland. Latvian intelligence reported this in a comment to Fox News. With a new round of hybrid aggression against European states, Russia seeks to force them to stop supporting Kyiv. At the same time, Latvian intelligence emphasized that Putin continues to receive distorted assessments of the situation within his own system, and this increases the risk of a miscalculation regarding the West's resolve.
They will continue to do so, increasing tension right up to the threshold of Article 5. Yes, this means hybrid attacks such as drone incursions, disinformation, propaganda, and probably other operations like arson maybe, or targeting our cables in the Baltic Sea. So this will likely escalate and of course heat up, but I don't think they'll dare to cross Article 5, as that would be suicide.
In response to potential risks from Russia, Lithuania continues to deploy an armored brigade to protect NATO's eastern flank. By 2027, according to German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, about 5,000 German soldiers will be stationed there. And his Lithuanian counterpart, Robertas Kaunas, stated that preparations for the deployment of the German brigade are ahead of schedule.
Within 3 years, we should prepare for the fact that regardless of which administration is in power, the Americans will reduce their presence in Europe to be able to step up their activities in the Indo-Pacific region. Many Europeans are unwilling to accept this,
We will do everything necessary to work together to ensure the security of this region and all of Europe, together with Germany, together with Ukraine, together with all NATO countries.
Berlin is now one of the key guarantors of security and defense in Europe. Germany has the largest defense budget in the European Union and has therefore taken on the role of the leading arms producer in the region. And against the backdrop of the growing Russian threat, the Bundeswehr has significantly increased military spending. As the country's foreign minister Johann Wadephul stated, the Russian Federation remains the main threat to the North Atlantic Alliance, and security in Europe is only possible if the Federation is countered.
We are deploying combat forces there only to make it clear that if NATO territory is attacked, and this can only mean an attack by Russia, German soldiers will defend every inch of the bloc's territory. That is our commitment, and it is absolutely clear. We need to clearly understand that at the moment, and I see no prospects of this situation changing in the foreseeable future, we can only ensure security in Europe in opposition to Russia. That is the sober, sad reality, but that is the reality.
On NATO's eastern flank, there are tens of thousands of troops from the alliance's member states. They are stationed in 9 countries: Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. 3 American brigades are also protecting this region. The soldiers are assigned to the 5th Corps Command, most of whom are dispersed along the eastern flank.
European countries have moved away from such an expeditionary mindset. So-called peacekeeping operations, yes, what we were doing in the last decade, moved to a wartime mindset, yes. And so the Baltic countries, Poland, Finland, Romania, everyone now understands that we are becoming, how should I say, the first line of defense against the aggressor, yes. And who the aggressor is no secret here.
European states are preparing for possible direct Russian aggression. According to estimates by European intelligence and military experts, the time frame for a hypothetical attack on NATO countries, specifically the Baltic states or Poland, ranges from 2 to 5 years. Nikita Skoblikov for Freedom TV channel.
And what do you think about these events? Share your opinion in the comments, give us a like and stay informed about the main news. More to come.